Right, we're on to nativism. This is part of the standard 1.2. We're talking about immigration. So, nativism is something that we're going to talk about today, some examples of that in this time period, especially where we're talking with the Second Industrial Revolution. So, the essential questions I have for you today is what is nativism and why does it occur? And then identify and explain how nativism created challenges for immigrant groups coming to America. So, really, some basic context, nativism, which we'll kind of talk more specifically, as long as there have been immigrants coming to this country, there's always been some sort of pushback by people who are already living here. The people who consider themselves "quote unquote" natives of America, and those who were born here, feel that this country is rightfully theirs, and their fear of people coming in and taking away that is something that's, like I said, all as long as you look at back in U.S. history, there's always going to be a sense of nativism. For example, Ben Franklin, one of our most important founders, he was very much against German immigrants. You'll find a lot of his writing talking about, how they, are pretty much don't have any intention to come and assimilate into American culture, and they'll ultimately destroy the more Germans that come here and outnumber the English. They'll destroy the kind of the common sense of America. He even quotes to say they were the most ignorant and stupid sort of their own nation. And yes, that was directly quoted from him. But it's not just Ben Franklin's feelings about it. There were other examples in the old wave of immigrants too. They had there was a party that was created, a political party in the 1950s because of the distrust of Irish, and how we have large waves of Irish coming because of the potato famine. There was a political party that was formed known as the Native American Party, whose sole purpose was that they would end immigration from Ireland and send the Irish back. They were also known as the Know Nothing Party and so forth, and they formulated, and that was pretty much the one ticket campaign that they were fighting for. You can even see this is one of their campaign, I'm going to say ads, but signs. So essentially, what is nativism? Essentially what it's a policy of protecting interests of the native born and establishing inhabitants against migrants and such. It really, it kind of boils down to xenophobia. It's this fear of the foreign people as they come into the country. I'm talking about where the Irish, why would people really worry about what the Irish was bringing with them? Well, the Irish were largely Catholics, and the people here were largely Protestants. And the fear was that if the Irish came here in such large numbers, continue to come here in such large numbers, that it would overwhelm the Protestants, and we would become a Catholic nation that would, answer to the Pope. So that was the fear, rational or not. That's essentially kind of what it was. And you find examples of xenophobia across our history, even today. There's a lot of xenophobia and fear of immigrants as they come here, legal or not, of what they bring with them and so forth. So every generation, going back to the first waves of immigrants to currently today, there's always been some sort of nativism that occurs with that. And why is that? In other words, you can talk about specific examples for each one of these groups, but as a overall, there is a lot of fear that when these migrants do come, one of the top reasons why is that they're stealing jobs. And stealing is like a term that a person who is nativist would believe. And factory workers, factory owners, love these immigrants as they come in because they could come in and treat them as poorly as they wanted to and pay them as little as they could. But that also meant more competition for people who were already here. And so they saw them as either taking the jobs or driving wages down. And so certainly there's a logical understanding by that and so forth. Is it necessarily true? That's a debatable topic, but certainly, that was the feeling from this side of people who were vehemently against immigration. There were people who went as far as kind of were afraid of that it would destroy the racial purity of America, and that we would kind of create some sort of Mongol race or whatever. And yes, is this racist? Oh, you bet you it is. But this was a belief at the time that was more popular than you would hear in today's world, not that you wouldn't hear it, but the belief that if you started, Italians marrying, Irish or anything like that, then it would make the genetics of our country impure in some way. Corruption in political systems. When these groups of people came, they were courted right away for their votes about any issues. A lot of the political machines and the people who ran city halls in these major cities did a lot to court these immigrant votes, and they're trying to get them to vote for them by bringing up policies and issues that are important to the immigrants may not necessarily be important or counterproductive for those who consider themselves the native born. Many of the people who came here were poverty stricken, and that's the case for a lot of them. You don't leave your country because everything's going well and you're well off. Typically, the people who came were the ones who were struggling to find work and struggling to make ends meet and so forth. And what they brought with them is what they could carry on their backs, or carry with them off the ships. And so, if that's all they had, then they come into the city, they're trying to find work and so forth, and there's only so much like housing and conditions. So a lot of them live in poverty as that result, and so people saw them as bringing the poverty with them. Not necessarily that be the case, but that was the viewpoint. There's always the argument that they bring crime with them. That was a complaint against people of Italian descent, that they brought the mafia with them and so forth. Whether organized crime existed already before the Italians arrived is pretty much debatable, and most likely in some form it already existed. But that's something of an argument that, why should we be against Italian immigrants? Because, they bring the mafia with them and they bring organized crime. But that's, like I said, this is the viewpoint of the nativists. Whether it's true or not is debatable. I would say most likely not. Not all people of Italian descent were part of the mafia. Come on. They believed that they would destroy the Anglo-Saxon Protestant principles of the society and such. That goes back to like when the Irish came here and they're Catholics. The viewpoints that they would make us more of a Catholic country instead of an Irish one. So that irrational fear was definitely something that hurt. There were alcoholics, people who come from Europe, Irish, German, go back to this one. Let's see, right here. This is a local cartoon. You can tell, it's a person is kind of supposed to be Irish. There's wearing an Irish whiskey barrel, and then this one's, wearing a lager beer barrel and such, and kind of depicting that the Irish and the Germans are both drunks and alcoholics and such. It's not an uncommon stereotype that's used for these groups. It's not necessarily true, but certainly because alcohol was a growing problem in the country, a lot of people blamed the influx of immigrants as the reason for that. And then even some people would say that the people that are being sent to our country were mentally ill because the other country, the country they're coming from, didn't want them, which is probably one of the more irrational fears of what's going on here. This whole situation does lead to violence, and it does lead to some legal actions by the government to curtail and stop the flow of certain groups into the United States. So we're going to look at some examples of those. So you can go back to, violence against immigrants in a lot of places. I've just picked out a few of them. 1834, a Catholic church was burned in Charleston, Massachusetts, probably mostly made up of Irish at that time, immigrants and so forth. 1840s, you have started to see some small-scale riots against the Irish Catholics and the nativists. If you've ever seen or heard the movie Gangs of New York, and I'm not recommending it, but they certainly show kind of that aspect of the immigration or some riots between the nativists and the Irish gangs that were in New York City at the time. 1870s really saw a rise of violence against the Chinese. And the Chinese, and really a lot what we'll talk about today, a lot of the violence and a lot of the actions of especially anti-immigration, were against the Chinese migrants who came here, recruited to come here to work on the railroads. A lot of people felt that they came here to work, and then the expectation was they returned back. Well, when many of them decide to stay and continue working and continue trying to establish a life here in America, there's going to be some pushback against that. And then the Chinese, considering that the physical features of Chinese were certainly different than European physical features, which probably played a role in the targeting of this particular group over other immigrant groups that do come. So in 1870s, you see that rise of violence and such, and some examples. In July of 1877, a mob burned down San Francisco's Chinatown. People were killed. I'm not exactly sure how many, but their homes and their shops were destroyed, essentially making it a hostile place for them to be. And this is not just in San Francisco. There were riots across California where a majority of the Chinese people had been settling and kind of creating their ethnic neighborhoods and so forth. So here's one example. Probably the best example, one that I know the most about, is 1885. There was a riot in Rock Springs, Wyoming, which is about 3 hours, maybe 4, closer to 3 hours west here on I-80. And Rock Springs was a mining town, had lots of Chinese employees and such. But there were a bunch of Irish workers who, whatever reason, either it's competition of the job, a lack of cultural understanding between the two. There's a lot of factors that probably play a role in it, but they essentially attacked the Chinese work camp and murdered at least 28. So it was a race riot that saw 28 Chinese migrants murdered as a result of that. So nativism doesn't just come in violence in terms of mob violence against the immigrants. There's also laws and pushing for more laws to limit the immigration of certain groups and all groups, really, in some cases, to the United States. So some examples: the alien contract labor laws basically made it illegal for laborers, prohibiting certain laborers from immigrating to the United States, and trying to protect American jobs that were somewhat skilled and necessary, but it was trying to protect Americans from being pushed off of those jobs by skilled workers that were coming from overseas. The Immigration Act of 1882 would lay heavy taxes onto each immigrant, and then it would also legally block, and I don't know how they determine some of these things, people from entering that were considered idiots, lunatics, convicts, or persons likely to become a public charge, meaning that they would come here and create some sort of disruption, like promoting a radical government policy, a radical government ideology. In the 1890s, they also began to slow the flow of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe by trying to require them to take a literacy test. And the literacy test was, of course, in their native language. But if you came here and couldn't read in your native language, the expectation was they wouldn't be able to either learn our language or be able to read our language either. So that was one way that they tried to slow down the flow of immigrants. You can see in this political cartoon on the screen here is kind of reflecting of that, where the literacy test almost acts like a wall of some sort to keep unwanted immigrants out. In 1913, the Webb Alien Land Act was passed in California. This prohibited people who considered aliens, immigrants, that from being able to possess land. And it would most affect people who were Chinese, Indian, Japanese, Korean immigrant farmers in California. The one, though, that you absolutely need to know about, and this will be on the test, I guarantee it, is the Chinese Exclusion Act. And this is the first example and one of the few examples in American history where a specific immigrant group was targeted as being a threat to the United States or a threat to someone, in which they bar the entire group from coming to the United States. And that's really, I mean, it's what's intended, but it doesn't really what ends up happening. But the act basically puts a moratorium, basically a seizing of Chinese laborers to come to the United States for at least 10 years. And it's in particular unskilled laborers that they're targeting most. They still do allow some skilled workers to come in, but they needed to have some sort of documentation from the Chinese government that proved that they were licensed skilled worker in some sort of industry, artisanship, whatever it is. And so, like, this is the first time again that the federal law had banned an ethnic group from our country. Despite this ban, and this is where immigration laws and so forth that we've created throughout history, a good example of what happens. The law says this, but doesn't necessarily mean that the stoppage of immigration is going to occur. So despite the ban, like, you still had Chinese immigrants who would travel to Mexico and then cross the border illegally into the United States to work on railroads, because the desire and availability of jobs in the West, the United States, still was very high, and people were going to come here and try to work somehow. So this kind of represented the first kind of wave of illegal immigration in the United States. Even, many of them would forge legal documents stating that they were born in the United States and that they were allowed to participate in something like chain migration, where they could bring back their sons or bring back, family members from China. And they, because they forged these documents, they were allowed to legally immigrate into the United States. They were known as the paper sons, and it became even a bigger issue when there was the San Francisco earthquake and fire in 1907, where a lot of the records were burnt to the ground. So pretty much like, it was, I don't have my immigration papers, but I can tell you everything I know about my family and so forth. And as long as I memorized it, they can get through the system. So, the Chinese Exclusion Act, even though it was intended on slowing the immigration of Chinese in particular, didn't stop it outright. So kind of going back one more time to the essential question, what is nativism and why does it occur? And then identify and explain the nativism, or how nativism created challenges for immigrant groups as they come into America. All right. So that's it for this lecture. The assignment that's connected to this is the Chinese Exclusion Act assignment, where you're going to be evaluating certain documents, looking for information pertaining to a particular question. So make sure that you take some time to do that. And I will see you next time.